is we need to start talking about trade and value added. And what does that mean? Well, think of the traditional measures that we may have used in the past. Exports to GDP, imports and exports to GDP, a degree of openness in the Canadian economy, a degree of exports relative to GDP. And in a world where, for example, firms would source all their inputs domestically, they would assemble goods, they would sell those goods abroad, or in a world where we would import goods and consume those goods within the domestic economy, those measures were okay. They meant something. They informed us a little bit about what was going on. But we're in a bit of a different world right now. We're in a world much more like this one, a world that looks at exports, but has to take into account that in constructing the goods behind those exports, we used a lot of inputs from other countries. So really, at the end of the day, what are we trading? What's the value added that's embedded in those exports? So, for instance, if you have if there's a producer in Canada that sources 95% of the inputs that go into the exported commodity from abroad, is it really fair to say that in this case our exports are $600 million? Or should we look at it from a different perspective? And that different perspective is what we call trade and value added. What we want to look at when we export goods and services abroad is not the gross level of exports, but we want to add what's the value that the Canadian firm added in that chain of exports. And that's one important measure that we're changing in Statistics Canada. In order to do this, and I'm going to take you through a little bit of macroeconomics accounting here, but just to illustrate the type of changes that we need to put in place. This is a very simple representation. We call this a supply and use table. You may have never heard of it. You may never hear of it again, but it's actually a very important, it's a key component of the macroeconomic accounts program in Canada, used abroad to model everything. But basically what this does is it tells us what's being produced in Canada, what are the inputs that are going into that production. It tells us what we do with that output, whether we export it, whether we consume it domestically. It tells us for all industries and all commodities. The Canadian supply and use tables have about 1 million cells of information embedded in them right now. And this is kind of the typical supply and use table that we have. Now, from something like this, it's very hard to understand in terms of global value chain how Canada fits in. We see that there's imports, so we know there's imports coming into the country. We know those imports are being used to produce outputs, cars in this case. We know those cars are being exported or they're being consumed domestically. But we really don't know from this table, well, who are we trading with? Where are we on the global production chain? What we've been developing at Statistics Canada and what we've been developing across the world, not just at Statistics Canada, but places like the OECD, are things that we call world supply and use tables, North American supply and use tables, APEC supply and use tables, where we start to add a geographic dimension to all of this information, where we start to look at output in Canada and Mexico and the U.S.,